Welcome to this new section on n8n basics, and this is a very exciting section because we're going to go into the most basic n8n functionality, and we're going to create some workflows that we can play around. It will give you a good foundation that will allow you to kind of play around with n8n on your own, create your own workflows based on your requirements, and so on, right? So it will give you the flexibility to do pretty much whatever you like. Even if you don't know all the nodes in n8n, after this section, you should be able to know enough so that you can experiment with new nodes and find out new functionality, and so on. What we will be talking in this section. First of all, we will learn how to start a workflow, right? So we create a workflow. How do you start it? And there are multiple ways to do that. These are what are called trigger nodes, so we will learn how to use them. Next, we're going to connect to online services with credentials. So connecting to online services is very useful. You simply cannot ignore it. In pretty much all workflows, you will connect to other services, so it's very important to learn how to do that. Then, we will learn how to add commentaries, so it's adding more information to your workflow so that if other people use your workflow, they will understand what's happening. And of course, also, if you get a workflow from online somewhere and you import it in n8n, you will learn what it does through the nodes. We will talk about AI agents. So these are, of course, AI integrated into our workflows, which allows us to do a whole range of things. So we will learn how to implement them. We will learn about tools. So how do we give extra functionality to our AI agents so that we will allow them to do things that aren't originally designed for. Then we will learn how to have custom knowledge for our AI agents. So for instance, if you have a business and you want to provide the business data to your agents so that maybe it can answer questions based on that data, we will see how we can do that. We will also talk about error handling. So sometimes things happen. Workflows might sometimes crash, so we will learn how to handle those errors and what to do in case that happens. And here again, there are multiple ways to handle that. So this is kind of an overview of what we will be talking about. We will go into more detail on each of these. So let's talk about the first node in a workflow, and that is the trigger node. So the trigger node comes in different shapes and sizes, but it's always used to start a workflow. And we can have multiple triggers for the same workflow. So for example, if you want to be able to test it manually, you have a trigger to run the workflow manually, but you can also run the same workflow using, let's say, a chat message or a URL call from somewhere online or things like that, right? And keep in mind here that you have active and inactive workflows which impact the way the workflow is triggered. So for example, if you have an inactive workflow, the triggers are going to work differently. So for example, you might be able to trigger it manually, but then when you have the workflow active, then you can call it using a URL to access and start the workflow. Okay, so let's see a few trigger nodes. So the first one is the manual trigger, right? The manual trigger. Let's see, I have here my n8n, I have a new workflow. And if I click on this array, first step, we have the manual trigger here, which simply allows us to execute the workflow and start it manually by ourselves. We don't really have any configuration for this trigger. We just are able to start the workflow manually using it. Next up, we have the on-schedule, right? The on-schedule allows us to start the workflow automatically on a particular schedule. So let me show you how this works. We have on-schedule, and here we can set the interval for running the workflow. We have days, weeks, months, hours, minutes, seconds. We have the number of, whatever you decide here. So let's say I want every hour I can run the trigger later. So I can start it at minute, whatever it is, right? So every hour, if I have the trigger set up like this, every hour the workflow will be triggered. Then we have the webhook. The webhook is basically a way for us to call the workflow through a URL. So I can call a URL from wherever I am online, and it will start the trigger. So let me show you how this works. I have on webhook call, and here I have the URL that I need to call. I can, of course, personalize this, so I can say something like workflow call, maybe with an underscore, and you can see that it's been modified here. Again, this is where this active inactive comes into play, because we have up here test URL and production URL. So these are going to work slightly differently. The only difference is the URL that I call. So for the test is webhook test, for production is webhook, right? And then we have the path authentication if we need to set any. And here we have the option to respond either immediately. So we call this URL, we get a response, and then we start the workflow. Or what's more common is using the respond to webhook node. And we will use this later on in one of our workflows, or maybe more of them. This simply says that we don't send the response now. We start the workflow continues until we reach a respond to webhook node, and then the response is given. So if I set here a respond to webhook, here I have the option to provide something. Of course, I haven't run anything, I don't have any data, but here we have the option to provide a response later on in our workflow. Okay, so that is one we'll be using quite often. Okay, so we have webhook, we have form submission, which is one we're going to use in our first workflow in the next video. And this one simply allows us to provide a form and get some information from the user. Okay, so we will see how this works. Basically, we add some elements here and get some information from the user. We will use this in the next video where we will create our first workflow. And finally, we have the chat message. It's very simple. We have a chat message here that allows us to open a chat window and say something like, hi. And you see that it's started, but there's nothing after it. For example, if we put an LLM here, we can have a conversation with a chatbot. Okay, so that's the chat message. Again, not much configuration. Here we can add some file uploads for, let's say, images and things like that. But usually you don't really need to do that. This is more for testing purposes. And of course, you have multiple other ways to start a workflow. We have email triggers. So when we receive an email, we might start a workflow. We have error handling, which we will look at later on in the course. Local files, MCP, and so on, right? So a lot of ways to start a workflow. We're not going to go into all of them, but feel free to explore them later on when you kind of understand the system, understand n8n, and can play around more freely with all the nodes. That will allow you to play around and understand all these nodes much better.